Vice President, and thank you for painting indeed a pretty grim picture, but true to our reality, unfortunately, but also for delivering a message of hope, which is part of the work that we are going to be doing, that you are going to be doing over the coming 2 days. And indeed, now has come the time to dive into the heart of the matter and to look at the roles that you all play. So I'd like to introduce the participants to our first panel and invite them to join me here on stage. And please welcome Belén Martínez Carbonell, who's the Managing Director for the Global Agenda and Multilateral Relations at the European External Action Service. Karim Khan joining us online, who's the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. Good morning to you. Can you see him on screen? Yes, you can. Good morning. Can you hear us, Mr. Khan? I'm sure he will hear us.
I can indeed. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. We have Oscar Parabera, who's Justice at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia. Shahrazad Akbar, who's the Executive Director of Rawadari in Afghanistan. Good morning to you. And Tetiana Pechonchuk, who is the head of the board at Zmina Human Rights Center in Ukraine. Please, Tatiana, join us. Good morning to you all. Please take a seat. I'm going to move my chair so that I can see you all. Yeah, I mean, come closer, maybe do not leave an empty seat in the middle. It's a symbolic seat for Mr. Khan. I'm sorry, at least that is see-through, so I can still see the audience. So I'm going to ask each of you to share with us your own personal experience of this morning's theme, or of this conference's theme, and what to you stopping impunity and the road to accountability and justice, what it means to you in your experience and in your daily life, in your daily work. And maybe I will start with you, Belén.
Good morning. Yes, it works. No, good morning to all of you. It is a pleasure for me to join you in the first plenary of this EU NGO Human Rights Forum. And I would like to thank everyone in my team and all the other teams that have worked so hard preparing all of this, and all of you for being there. Sadly, the theme of this year, Stop Immunity, the road to accountability and justice, is very topical. I always say that I won the lottery the day I was born. I was born in a peaceful Europe, in a normal family where my rights were never put to question. But sadly today, war has returned to Europe. And with it, the willful disregard of international law and widespread and atrocious violations of human rights. And that has made all of us in Europe to think again about how important human rights and peace are, how much we should cherish it. Because we know that beyond Europe, in many countries and regions in the world, crisis and conflict have been causing hundreds of thousands of victims every year. We continue witnessing an alarming rise in blatant human rights violation and abuses compounded by perversive impunity. So in this challenging situation, it is often you, human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, civil society organizations, journalists and academics, who lead the way in calling for justice and accountability, often at the peril of your own lives. I'm glad to see that human rights defenders from all over the world have been able to make it to Brussels today. You are the real protagonist of this forum, and your role in closing the existing accountability gap is crucial. You contribute to monitoring and documenting human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, holding authorities accountable, ensuring that victims receive the support and protection they need and have access to redress and remedy. This is essential to contribute to a broader sense of justice, both within and outside affected societies, but also to prevent the recurrence of violations through deterrence of future crimes. As European Union, we have clearly articulated policy on the framework of on accountability. It is enshrined, as you know, in the Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy 2024 that we are starting to review in the coming days. We have set out concrete activities for fighting impunity and strengthening accountability, and these activities will remain very much at the heart of our reviewed action plan. Since 2015, we have also equipped ourselves with an EU policy framework on transitional justice, which includes a full range of processes and mechanisms, both judicial and non-judicial. The High Rep was referring to some of the activities in that framework. We're now implementing these commitments with concrete action. In terms of concrete action to support civil society and human rights defenders, we have provided, since last January, support to more than 3,600 individuals, which is a high figure. And I'm sure there are many more out there we would have wished to support, but that gives you already the tall order of the challenge. And we have recently renewed our commitment to fund and expand the multifaceted and flexible support for the human rights defenders mechanism, protectdefenders.eu, with, as the High Rep was saying, 30 million euro for the next 3 years. And I think it's one of the instruments we are proudest of. During his speech, the High Representative has also recalled the EU firm commitment to the International Criminal Court. And the EU support, both political and financial, to the ICC and its independence, it's unwavering. We're committed to cooperate with the ICC to guarantee its effectiveness and efficiency, and we expect the states to lend the necessary assistance and support. At the same time, the EU remains one of the biggest financial supporters of international institutions and mechanisms to promote accountability. At the same time, we're also developing the capacities of partner countries to conduct their own investigations, prosecution and transitional justice processes. The years ahead of us will continue to be challenging. The road of accountability, let's be frank, will not be easy. It will be long and full of obstacles. We must not be sidetracked. We must be guided by a clear objective in our mind. Perpetrators of unspeakable crimes must and will be held accountable. The victims deserve justice and reparation, as you all know much better than I do. I look forward to our discussion this morning, hearing all of you in this panel and from Prosecutor Khan, how we can further contribute to domestic and international accountability efforts in order to ensure better access to justice for victims. Thanks a lot. Looking forward to hearing you all.
Thank you very much. Mr. Khan, I'll turn to you because I think it's interesting to hear right now, before we move to our next speakers, what is your experience of stopping impunity? I mean, it is, after all, what you do every day. So what is your personal experience of accountability and justice?
Well, thank you so much, Florence, and it's a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to say a few words to those that are gathered today. So really my sincere thanks to the European External Action Service, to the Human Rights and Democracy Network, and for the many civil society organizations that are present. Unfortunately, the simple truth is impunity is alive and kicking. The European Union was formed in significant part in the shadow of the Second World War. And it's actually a shadow that should not be forgotten. This is why we say we will never forget. It's why we remember the men and the women that died during the two great wars in Europe. Many of the European features, the architecture, the European Convention of Human Rights, were also erected, they were constructed in the hope of forging ever closer union, but also bonds between the men and the women and the children of this continent, not only because of economic advancement, but because so many suffered so much during the dark days of the Second World War. And it's important to remember that shadow. It's important to remember, just a stone's throw away, almost in Treblinka, we have the gas chambers that must remind us of impunity. And we also need to recognize, without defensiveness, that we failed collectively, because we promised there would be never again. And as we cast our gaze around the world in different parts, whether it's the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether it's what's happening in Ukraine or in so many parts of Africa or the Middle East, we see children and women and men suffering. I think the key is to realize that there is an opportunity now. There's an opportunity because we have seen very clearly in recent days the risk of escalation, that human rights breaches and allegations of breaches of international criminal law can spill over and affect all of us in myriad different ways. And complacency really is the enemy of peace. So the idea that we need to be constantly vigilant is very important. And how do we do it? It's by partnerships. Civil society have a key role to play. We've tried, since I became prosecutor, to build on those relationships. We have just recently produced a handbook with Eurojust and with the Genocide Network to help civil society organizations. My deputy prosecutor, Nazat Shamim Khan, is with you in Brussels, and she will also speak more about these types of issues. We had the first roundtable last month on children, in which we brought civil society from 11 situation countries. 70 civil society were organized, focusing on crimes against and affecting children. And I think the simple truth is, every resource, every national authority, every regional organization that wishes to stand shoulder to shoulder with humanity, that wishes to not only express pious hopes, but actually is willing to persevere and sweat and put forward the effort, have a role to play. We've seen, particularly since the Syria conflict, an increase of the utilization in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well, of the activation of domestic jurisdictions. And I've said the ICC is not an apex court, we're a hub. And we also have to provide assistance to national law enforcement so that there can be accountability wherever it is possible, in the situation country where the crimes are being committed, or the ICC as a court of last resort, but also in any country that has universal jurisdiction or other criminal jurisdiction. Because what we have to do better, Florence, is to make sure that our words don't evaporate the minute they leave our lips, that we realize that the promise, indeed the obligation of never again, the moral imperative of never again, is activated effectively. And there's no one silver bullet that will help us get there. There's no one silver bullet that will help us solve the malady that afflicts humanity in so many parts of the world. But partnership is absolutely essential. And imagination. We closed after 17 years a preliminary examination in Colombia supporting the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. So a new posture in which we're supporting the national system. In Colombia, we opened an investigation in Venezuela at the same time as signing an MOU in Caracas, trying to support the Venezuelan authorities to build their own system in a way that it could become effective and have genuine and effective investigations. I was in Cox's Bazar on the 24th of February when the Russian invasion of Ukraine commenced, and I made a statement there, and we see people there cannot be forgotten. The children in those refugees camps in Cox's Bazar have a right to justice. And I do think there's optimism, because what we've seen in stark focus, because of the events, perhaps particularly of Ukraine, and it's resonated in capitals around the world, not because human life is more precious there, because that would be an abomination. Every human life is equally important. But I think because of certain realities in terms of the threats to tactical nuclear weapons that have been talked about, and the economic consequences of a permanent member of the Council engaging in activity in the type that seems to be taking place. We've realized that selectivity is very corrosive to the fabric of justice. We need to comply with the law as all states, including democratic states, even when we have the upper hand. We need to act with restraint, because if we don't, if we act that the law is a tradable commodity, if we try to airbrush out provisions of law that affect political interests or even short-term national priorities, in a way we erode something that is not owned by us. It is something that we are sworn and obligated to protect, because millions have spilt their blood fighting for it in the Second World War and in wars of colonialism and conflicts around the world. So the EU has an important role to play. Just today, I'm delighted to announce that we have the agreement with the European Union has been signed by my office and the court, in which 7.5 million euros has been received by the office to transform the e-discovery and the information technology infrastructure of the office. That's half of all the contributions we received in relation to the trust fund that I opened in March. That's 15 million, so more than half from the EU. So I think the EU has a lot to be proud of in terms of standing with justice and working effectively. And I take the opportunity of applauding both Vice President Joseph Borrell and also Didier Reynders, the Commissioner for Justice, but the External Action Service and the Commission as a whole to move forward. But this is a time where you really have to deliver, because the stakes simply cannot be higher. And I think the role of civil society is one that we need to activate in the ways that I've said. The other aspect is field presence. Selectivity can come from a couple of causes. One is a lack of will and a lack of restraint and decisions made by capitals of the world over a period of time that can invisibly corrode the fabric of international law instead of fortifying it. But the other one is when we're not giving resources. And we have to, as those on the coal face working with civil society, dealing with victims, have to make imperfect decisions on prioritization. Now, just yesterday, or last week, I should say, on Friday, the Assembly of State Parties agreed a budget which gave an increase to the office only in line with inflation. So no increase at all in real terms. My budget for this year, for the whole of the 123 countries we're dealing with, was 49.5 million. It's been increased for 2023 to 54 million. So that's no increase in real terms. It's only in line with inflation because of the moment we're in. Now, victims are going to keep being disappointed, and there will be vicious and vituperative criticism, rightly so, regarding what the office can possibly deal with. I would have to make tough decisions probably next year based upon this, in terms of certain situations we can deal with and those we can't. So we have to back the institutions that have been created. We've got to make sure they are properly funded. Institutions cannot be rendered into fig leaves to deny support. And at the same time, we need to not be disillusioned or despondent, because I am optimistic. For all the inadequacies and the limitations that surround the resources given to my office, there is a glimmer of hope that in 48 hours, 39 countries referred the Ukraine matter to the office. We now have 43 countries, a third of all state parties, standing shoulder to shoulder with those that want a world and a future, not just for Ukraine, but around the world, where the law is rendered potent and meaningful. The challenge is going to be ensure that this discussion, this discourse, and this words of support are translated, number one, into effective support, and number two, they expand like ripples in a pond beyond Ukraine into other situations where people are groaning in misery, people in Kalma camp, in Darfur, the people in Libya. And we need to realize we need to be closer with them. The office is trying to have a field presence, but I go back, given the time, to a principle. We can only succeed if we stand together. States, civil society, institutions. The ICC with the European Union as a beacon of justice, trying to give life, however imperfectly also, to the principles of justice where every man, woman, and child is viewed without discrimination and has a future based upon their hard work and those minimum standards. And I think if we realize the law is not as strong as we want, we can also focus at the same time to those that want to abuse their positions, inflict pain and suffering, target the most vulnerables, with concrete examples that we've seen in the former Yugoslavia, in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, in the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia, in Rwanda, of course, and in the ICC, that don't think the law is as weak as you think. There is a gaining momentum that there has to be justice if there is to be peace. And in that, the Office of the Prosecutor that I lead, the men and women of the office that are working extremely hard, join hands with you, civil society, the European Union, and everybody else that wants to try to work harder for a less painful tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for what was really more of a passionate plea, and I think everybody here could feel that passion. Oscar, we have already heard about Colombia. Both Vice President Borrell and Karim Khan just mentioned Colombia on various occasions. And indeed, the special jurisdiction for peace is a very important not institution, but organization, if I can use that word, to help you in your work. So in your experience, what are the major advances and the major progress that has been made in order to involve victims in their procedure to ensure accountability of the perpetrators?
Thank you for your question, Florence, and thank you for the organizers to having me here to present these ideas about the special jurisdiction for peace in Colombia, where we are working from 2018, and during the last 5 years, we are working so hard in order to combine the effort to find justice for victims, but at the same time, the effort of achieving political settlement for an armed conflict like the armed conflict in Colombia during the previous 50 years. Because of that, we organized a scheme of work in the context of an integral system of transitional justice. The special jurisdiction is the judicial part of that integral system with another mechanisms of transitional justice, but extrajudicial mechanisms combined with the judicial efforts from the special jurisdiction for peace. And it is important for me to highlight the massiveness of the atrocity in Colombia during the armed conflict. We are talking about in a country with more than 50 million of inhabitants. We are talking about more than 8 million of victims and hundreds and thousands of victims of extrajudicial killings, kidnapping, forced displacement, recruitment, sexual violence, and forced disappearances, among other international crimes. And we organize several stages of procedures in order to promote participation for victims. We are talking about, in particular, I would like to highlight our work with mega cases. This is so important to share with all of you this day. We are working with several mega cases. At this moment, we have 11 mega cases. And what is a mega case? And how And why this is important? This is important because we are working now in a new approach in prosecuting macro criminality. We are talking about, for instance, a mega case on kidnappings, considering more than 20,000 of kidnappings during 20 years of armed conflict in one procedure, in one scheme of participation of victims of kidnappings. Another example is another mega case regarding extrajudicial executions. More than 6,000 of extrajudicial executions during almost a decade in the armed conflict. And we are talking about more than 6,000 of extrajudicial executions in one procedure. And these two examples try to present our approach to prosecution of systemic crimes. We are not taking individual crimes in an isolated way, and we are organized all the evidence, all the crimes in a structural mechanism. Because of that, we are talking about prosecution organized by prioritization and selection. These are two important concepts about the work of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Prioritization means that we can organize the demand of justice. We have to present to the society which is the best way to prioritize several cases at the first time, and in the second time, another kind of cases. And we are working beyond the approach of focusing on temporal, spatial, and topical circumstances of individual cases in order to demonstrate macrocriminal patterns and criminal plans, and the structures and groups and criminal groups behind of these patterns. And finally, we are focusing on unveiling the main and highest criminal responsibilities. This is so important because the ordinary proceedings in Colombia did a very special work with individual cases, but only with focusing in the minor levels of the chain of command, for instance. Our work is focusing in the highest criminal responsibilities. And finally, I would like to put in only 2 minutes what we are doing in the context of restorative justice. Because in the context of the peace negotiations and the political peace accords in Colombia, the special jurisdiction was created. And because of that, we have to promote restorative justice, and in order to balance retributive justice and restorative justice. And only one idea of this point. The critical issue here is the participation of victims. And because of that, our first step was gather reports from institutions and civil society. For instance, in this kind of mega cases that I mentioned before, we receive more than 40 or 50 reports from civil society, NGOs, or victims participating directly before the special jurisdiction. We recognize collective participation before the special jurisdiction, and we present this information from the victims before the perpetrators. And the dialogue between victims and perpetrators construct a road for public recognitions, public acknowledgement of responsibilities of this kind of atrocities. I will tell you a little bit more in the context of the questions later, but this year we performed 3 public hearings between victims and perpetrators of crimes against humanity, perpetrators of war crimes, face to their victims, trying to pursue trying to dialogue around restorative mechanisms to dignify the victims, to construct a new peace scenarios in the communities vulnerated, and to construct new scenarios of restorative sanctions for the future. Because of that, I think that the Colombian case is an example for the world, with several criticisms regarding a lot of these topics, but with several participation from the victims from the ground in the most vulnerable spaces in Colombia, trying to construct peace and construct democracy for the future.
Thank you. Shahrazad, if I'm not mistaken, Rawadari means tolerance, lenience. So how does that idea fit into the mission of stopping impunity and leading to accountability in your daily work?
Thank you. First of all, I'm really truly honored to be here and to be speaking to all of you, to be learning from my very esteemed panelists. Thank you for having me. I'm speaking here as an activist, but also as a victim, and as an activist in exile. The fact that I'm not speaking today from Afghanistan and I can't continue to work there is because of continued culture of impunity, partly because of the continued culture of impunity, which has led to conflict, contributed to a long-standing conflict in my country. In Rawadari, the organization that we have just established, we are talking about tolerance in the way, in a sense of creating a society that respects pluralism, that respects different lived experience of the, part of it is respecting and accepting different lived experience of the conflict. Because the conflict in my country, which has been a very long-standing conflict with culture of impunity, really did not allow the space for the victims, for victims of all different sets of perpetrators, to come out with their truth and to seek accountability and justice. So we have, even in the past 20 years of international intervention in Afghanistan, there wasn't the political will on part of the international community, as well as the Afghan government, to prioritize accountability, to prioritize justice. And as a consequence, while we built a legal framework that was in line more or less with international law, and we tried to build institutions that would uphold that legal framework, those institutions failed to deliver justice to victims. Those institutions, because of the lack of political will, stayed distant and inaccessible to victims of atrocities. So from my experience in Afghanistan, the work that we have done there, and the work of the civil society in Afghanistan, we understand that accountability is hard because several things need to happen at the same time for victims to experience justice. You need to have the institutions that are well-resourced, that are transparent, that have the political will to act. You need to have a legal framework that's accessible, that has come out of a consultative process that's not only outward-looking, because what we did with our legal framework was we were more concerned about bringing it in line with international obligations rather than making sense of it for the people who are supposed to utilize it, for the victims who are supposed to utilize it, to integrate their local understandings of justice and accountability in the legal framework that we were building, so that they would have buy-in and they would understand that it wouldn't be something so distant from them. But also you need an independent and well-resourced civil society who can then hold these institutions accountable, watch over these institutions, improve this legal framework, act as a bridge between the victims and the institutions. And you also need to do a lot of work. I think if you want to stop impunity, you need to do a lot of work on mobilizing the victims and making resources available to them for them to mobilize, to utilize the institutions, to access the institutions. One example from that in Afghanistan was with the process with the ICC, the investigation in Afghanistan. One of the most moving experiences was not what our government did or the fancy institutions that were put in the place or even the UN. It was the work of civil society with victims from across Afghanistan who were probably first time hearing about the court, but it gave them a glimmer of hope. They would travel, taking risks, security risks, to come and share their experiences. They would have to overcome several barriers, language barriers, literacy barriers, to access the court, to make sure that their experience is part of this investigation. So the other moving example of an effort for justice in Afghanistan was all the work that was done around memorialization, the work that was done around bringing victims in the same room from different parts of the country who may have, because of also the ethnic divisions, the fragmentation, who may have felt we are the only victims of this conflict, to sit with people from different groups, from different communities, and to recognize that shared pain. To have that moment of common recognition, to say, yes, we have all survived atrocities, yes, we have all been victims of injustice, yes, we are all seeking justice despite all our differences. And that's what we mean when we talk about Rawadori, is to promote a culture where there is a growing recognition of the fact that lack of justice and impunity will lead to lack of peace for everyone. In terms of what the EU could do more and better, I really think that it's, especially coming from Afghanistan, and earlier the High Representative also spoke about how Afghanistan is being forgotten. I think it's really important to continue to build on the human rights culture of the country. The institutions are no longer in place. The legal framework has been abolished by the Taliban. There are ongoing atrocities. The atrocities against women, the limitations can amount to a gender apartheid, but that doesn't mean all the hope is lost. I receive daily messages from victims who want to be connected to international mechanisms, who want to be connected to the court. People know that what's happening is wrong, and they are seeking remedies. And I think it's on the international mechanisms to take steps to become more accessible in the context where there is literally right now no national mechanisms for access to justice in that sense. And that bridging that can happen comes from the Afghan human rights community operating inside the country with extreme levels of risk, but also now in diaspora. So how do we make sure that this community is well supported to continue this bridging, to make sure that victims receive a minimum of support and protection, and that yearning for justice, that demand for justice and human rights continues? Because I do think that if we continue to fail, in the context of Afghanistan, if we continue to fail to deliver justice, we will see not only a continuation of the conflict, but also a continued diminishing credibility for the human rights discourse overall. Because what's human rights for the victims if they continually see their perpetrators in power and getting away with impunity? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Tatiana, of course, you're living in an ongoing conflict, and you're probably putting in place what will happen, hopefully, after the conflict, when it's over. And we already heard from Karim a few minutes ago that there are already 43 countries that are lined up to make sure that there is accountability after the conflict. So what does this stopping impunity and accountability issue mean to you?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to see here such diverse and bright audience. And I would like to start with my words of gratitude to many countries and activists, human rights defenders, to many governments that are standing together with Ukraine throughout these difficult days. It is already 8 years, 9 months and 24 days of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. And I arrived from Kiev. I'm the head of the Human Rights Center Zmina. During the last 10 years, my NGO is doing human rights work in Ukraine, starting from March 2014 we've been documenting grave human rights abuses and war crimes in the occupied peninsula of Crimea, and we were continuing to do it during the last 8 years. And starting from 24th of February this year, our work related to the war crimes documentation has expanded, and together with 30 other Ukrainian NGOs which are united in the Ukraine 5 AM coalition, we do documentation of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during this recent large-scale wave of Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. And I arrived to Brussels yesterday late evening, and this morning I woke up from another very sad news coming from Kiev, another grim morning for my home city when Ukrainian capital was attacked with 13 Iranian kamikaze drone Shaheds. This is 144th attack on Ukrainian energy system starting from the beginning of this large-scale aggression. 3/4 out of them were committed during the last 2 months when cold and winter is coming to Ukraine. All this time, my team of the Human Rights Center Zmina, together with many other Ukrainian NGOs with human rights defenders, continue to work tirelessly in Ukraine, in different cities, although that was not an easy for us, especially during the last 2 months. We continue to work, often without heating and electricity. Sometimes we have electricity only 4 hours per day. Sometimes without water supply, without cell phone connection. Russia aims to freeze us, but they reach opposite goal because nation is more and more united. And here I would like to speak about 4 challenges that we face if we speak about justice and fighting impunity with regard to all atrocities committed in the course of Russian armed aggression. First challenge is numbers. We have huge scope of atrocities committed in Ukraine, starting from 2014. As of today, the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine has registered 51,000 criminal proceedings based on the facts of war crimes committed in Ukraine. It's a huge number, but it's not final, because war is continuing, and every day new and new episodes of war crimes are being registered. And from the other side, these data mainly don't include the episodes from the territories which Ukrainian government don't control, like the city of Mariupol and many other territories. When these areas will be liberated, there could be thousands of new war crimes which will be registered. And these numbers are only confirmed by our own documentation that my NGO is doing in Ukraine in the course of field missions to the liberated areas. We've recently done such missions to the Donetsk region, to Kharkiv region, to Kherson region, where we collect and document a number of cases of enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, indiscriminate shellings of civilian infrastructure, torture cases, sexual violence, looting, deportations, and many other facts. Disaster and destruction come with Russian army. They erase Ukrainian cities from the surface. At the current moment, this is a city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, where the situation is very difficult. Russians promise to restore our cities, but the first infrastructure object they arrange when they occupy the territory is a torture cell. Russians abduct, torture, and execute active members of the local communities in Ukraine. City mayors, village heads, journalists, activists, volunteers, human rights defenders, writers, religious leaders, school teachers, and many others. Only our NGO at the moment has documented 386 cases of enforced disappearances in the territories which were taken by the Russian army. But in general, we assess that there are thousands of enforced disappearances in Ukraine. And just one case I would like to mention is the case of Volodymyr Vakulenko. He was a children's writer, and he disappeared in March in the village of Kapitolivka near Izum, Kharkiv region. His body was one of 400 bodies which were exhumated from the mass graves in Izum. And DNA analysis recently proved that this was a body of Volodymyr Vakulenko. So the question is how to ensure adequate resources for international and state actors and for civil society to document and investigate such number of war crimes that all victims can expect that justice will happen. And the second question is how to return names to those numerous victims of Russian aggression that now turned into numbers. Then the second challenge that we have if we speak about the justice is time. I understand that justice needs time, that results can be delayed, but we ask, for how long should we wait? Of course, there are crimes that need time and investigation to identify those who abducted, who tortured concrete persons, especially having the fact that they are hiding their faces and identities. But there are crimes that are on the surface. It is attacks on Ukrainian energy system, which already caused 77 persons being murdered and another 272 being injured. The ICC investigators are hiding together with Ukrainians in bomb shelters in Ukraine, while Russian President Vladimir Putin on Russian television openly said, yes, we did it. How much time and evidence must be collected to indict Mr. Putin and to declare him and other top leadership of Russian Federation as internationally wanted suspects? And will it be ever done? The third challenge that we have is gaps in the international justice system. At the moment, the International Criminal Court is conducting its investigation into the situation in Ukraine with regard to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide, but not the crime of aggression. But this war, the very fact of Russian unprovoked attack on Ukraine, is a source of all other crimes. But there is no body internationally that can deal with that crime. That's why we support the work which is being now done by the Ukrainian government and calls to establish a special tribunal on the crime of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Political consensus is being built up around this idea. There were several resolutions at the level of the Council of Europe, European Parliament calling to establish such a tribunal. And we hope that such a resolution will be also voted by the UN General Assembly. And just on Monday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Wonke Hoekstra, announced that Netherlands are ready to create and accept such a tribunal. But then fourth challenge that we have is the existing gaps with justice mechanisms and investigations at the national level in Ukraine. Ukraine still hasn't ratified Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and there is no explanation why it hasn't been done. Ukraine has to become a full member of the International Criminal Court and also to accept Kampala amendments of the Rome Statute, because it is very important that Ukraine also recognizes the crime of aggression as international crime. And also at the national level, we call Ukrainian authorities to harmonize Ukrainian legislation, our criminal code with international standards, with international criminal and humanitarian law. We are now in the time of war, and we conduct our reforms in the time of Russian armed aggression. Now we have more windows to do it and to push our authorities to transform Ukraine in more and more democratic countries. And this is maybe one of the unique examples when country is being transformed during the warfare. For example, in June this year, Ukraine has ratified Istanbul Convention against domestic violence, and we welcome that step of Ukrainian authorities. Just yesterday, Ukrainian parliament voted two important pieces of law when it comes to human rights. It's a law on the protection of national minorities and media law, which is also important with regard to EU candidate status. But we still need the full reform of the judicial sector in Ukraine, law enforcement, prosecutor's office, because we need these institutions also to investigate war crimes committed in Ukraine, because it's largely a domestic task for Ukrainian authorities and for civil society. We hope that justice will prevail, and it will be also a signal that neither Russia nor other aggressive countries would attack their neighbors and would commit such a huge number of atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. I'd like to actually, I will give you, Belen, a right to answer in a few minutes, but Shahrazad actually anticipated what was going to be my next question, because it would be interesting to hear from our three speakers from the human rights side of things what all three of you think that the EU can do better in order to engage with either international or national mechanisms and governments in order to support more accountabilities. Shahrazad, you already touched upon the answer, but maybe Oscar, what do you think the EU could do maybe more, better, to support accountability?
Okay. I think that this is important in Latin America, in Colombia, and in general in this context of the pursuing of accountability, to support participation of victims in all of these procedures. Because of that, I would like to highlight in the Colombian case, this kind of participation was related to, first, the construction and presentation of reports from the victims before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And this is so important because it's the voice of the victims with a key role for the whole procedure. This is so important because in the context of restorative mechanisms in Colombia, the voice of the victims has played a key role in order to obtain acknowledgement of responsibility. Sometimes we organize we charge perpetrators of international crimes, but the voice of the victims was critical for the acknowledgement of responsibility beyond the juridical part of the charges. It was most important the voice of the victims. And second, the participation of victims regarding the accountability of the perpetrators. This is so important because we have heard a lot of perpetrators, maybe more than 1,000 of perpetrators during these 5 years of the performance of the special jurisdiction. But we have to hear the voice of the victims regarding the testimony of the perpetrators. This is an important role for the victims. And finally, considering this dialogue between perpetrators and victims, the European Union and another kind of international mechanisms of cooperation and supervision has a key role to promote these kind of dialogues in order to preserve the dignity, the importance of remedies for victims, and the importance of constructing peace in the most vulnerable territories facing a lot of political violence. Because of that, the role of the European Union is critical in order to promote the participation of victims.
Thank you. Shahrazad, you already touched upon that particular point, but would you agree with Oscar that the voice of victims is an absolutely essential component of the EU's role?
Absolutely. I think for, at least in my experience, in my context in Afghanistan, the international players and actors seemed so distant. And there was also a very acute awareness. Prosecutor earlier spoke about this issue of selectivity. There is an acute awareness among victims of issues of selectivity and the fact that the international mechanism, for instance, the UN Human Rights Council or the ICC, they watch how these bodies act in different situations. And they are watching very closely what resources they are making available for the atrocities in Afghanistan. The UN Human Rights Council, after a lot of advocacy by Afghan human rights community and our international partners in the human rights movement, appointed a special rapporteur for the human rights situation in Afghanistan. Since the appointment of the special rapporteur, and gradually since the Taliban takeover last year, the human rights situation has gotten worse and worse and worse. And the response from the international community is business as usual, right? We are not even open to considering a stronger accountability mechanism despite the worsening human rights situation. So what can EU do? We saw this firsthand in the process of appointing the special rapporteur, that we went to EU first, asking them to mobilize the council, to mobilize support for an accountability mechanism for Afghanistan. I think this role really remains important. And sustaining EU's credibility as a force for human rights, especially if there is awareness of the fact that EU needs to do this in all contexts where there are atrocities and violations. I think the support for the human rights defenders is very important in the context of conflict and crisis. All forms of protection that can be made available so that that cadre of human rights defenders or those courageous people are protected and continue to do their work, whether inside the country or in exile, or with means being made available for temporary relocation. And yes, I think victims, it's essential, the voice of victims. Thinking about justice in a way that centers victims, their experiences, their stories, their voices, their expectations, because sometimes, yes, criminal accountability is important, but there are immediate needs of the victims that need to be met, and that's a wholesome thinking of reparations. For instance, in the context of Afghanistan, we kept talking to international forces about allegations of abuse and civilian harm, and in addition to criminal accountability, we kept bringing the immediate needs of the communities who had suffered as a consequence of the conflict, saying individual reparations are not enough. These communities, as communities, have been affected. Their livelihoods, their infrastructure has been affected because of the conflict. What can you do to remedy that? And it's only with bringing victims into the conversation and centering their experience that you can think about justice in that more wholesome and more inclusive way.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and Tatiana, I mean, it's probably still too early for you to be able to give victims a clear enough or a loud enough voice, but what would be, in your view, at this stage, the new things that the EU could do in order to engage more with international and national mechanisms?
Yes, actually, we work with people's stories, with victims, with documentations, starting from the first day, and it is very important that their voices are heard at every international platform. And speaking about the support that we expect from the EU and our calls to the European Union, I have 3 points. First of all, we need resources and capacity building if we speak about the national investigation. We need the resources and capacity building for Ukrainian state authorities and civil society to continue collection of the data and investigation, proper documentation of the facts. At the moment, we desperately need technical support, generators, Starlinks, to continue our work throughout this winter. Second, we called European Union to continue its support of the work of the International Criminal Court and continue provided all needed resources for the ICC investigators and prosecutors, and support the establishment of the special tribunal on the crime of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. And third, we also called European Union to push Ukrainian authorities to conduct democratic reform and transformations in Ukraine during this wartime. I'm specifically speaking about the reform of judiciary system, law enforcement and prosecutor's office, especially if we speak about their capacity to deal with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And also to demand from Ukraine to ratify Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, because all the reasons why it was not done are based on some wrong assumptions and false myths. I would like to see my country as a full member of the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Belen, you've heard some of the proposals and suggestions made by our human rights defenders, representatives. I'm not sure you can answer all of them at this stage. You probably need to digest them and see what can be done, if at all. But maybe you can try to answer some of the suggestions and also give us a few examples of partnerships that the EU has put in place and has been active in order to foster accountability.
No, thanks a lot. Clearly, it is a high toll, a high order. Not sure we can do it all, but we clearly doing, as the children say, our best. I've taken a few notes of what you demand. Maybe if I start with Ukraine, you have mentioned democratic reforms and many other reforms. And as you know, that's part of the path that the EU has set for Ukraine with this offer of accession. And there is not an easy ride to becoming a member of the EU, and that's precisely why. Because we demand countries to strongly commit and duly enforce a number of reforms, and we have a lot of admiration for your government and the hard work they're putting on this. There's been references to the ICC and Ukraine's accession to the ICC. This is already in the Article 8 of the association agreement that Ukraine signed with the EU. So it's a clear commitment that the EU and the Ukraine took together already before 24th of February. And we're looking forward to Ukraine signing in due time. But we're doing many more things, possibly not enough, because I think there's a lot to be done in Ukraine. But we have a project called Bravo Justice 2, and together with the EU Advisory Mission Ukraine, EUAM, we are providing strategic advice, operational assistance and training to the Ukrainian accountability system. But we're also cooperating with the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor in its investigations and prosecution of crimes. And we have joined forces in this regard with the US and the UK friends in a mechanism which is called Atrocity Crime Advisory Group, but that's the more, the less important part. The important thing is that we're all very much aware that there are many of us coming into Ukraine, and it's important to coordinate our efforts so that we all can respond to your needs in the best coordinated manner. It's one of the calls that Prosecutor Khan has often made, that there are many of us with good intentions, and it's important that all these good intentions are channeled properly, because there's work for everyone. In the case of Colombia, which is a country I know well and it's close to my heart. The EU, we support since a long time efforts to protect social leaders and human rights defenders, and we have been particularly supporting the Special Investigation Unit of the Attorney General's Office. But we have also continued to support this interesting campaign together with our EU member state called Defendamos la Vida. Because I think it's important that we support you, but also that people know that we support you. And you have mentioned in your intervention the importance on transitional justice processes, which we truly believe, also because Colombia is an example on which many countries might look tomorrow for the way transitional justice has been run. And there we have a new project under preparation to support precisely this transitional justice system. And if you aren't aware, I'm sure my colleagues can give you all the details later. We are planning a funding up to 15 million euros. Finally, on Afghanistan, you have mentioned the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, which is something we have been strongly supporting. But we have also supported the Human Rights Unit of UNAMA, yeah, and obviously the work of the ICC and all the fantastic work the civil society organizations are doing in Afghanistan. But as I say, this is what we can do. It sometimes might look like a drop in the ocean, but we hope that together we can make the best out of all this support.
Thank you, Belen. Karim, I'd like to come back to you because we know that national authorities sometimes, and in some cases often, fail to fulfill their responsibilities, and they do not bring perpetrators to accountability. So in that case, what can an international justice organization like the ICC do? What role can you play? What leeway do you have?
Well, a number of things. I mean, we see domestically, but also internationally, great imperfections and a range of how we seek to uphold justice. So you're quite right. Sometimes states are not cooperating as fully as really they are required under the Rome Statute, but also under general principles of international law. At the same time, we've seen an activation around the world of a range of other methods to ensure compliance. And I think, bespoke solutions can be affected in different situations. We all know about Majeski sanctions and travel bans. There's different ways of putting pressure and on individuals to either surrender themselves, but also we saw it in the former Yugoslavia, without the incentive and the requirement, in fact, of the European Union, that if there was hope of accession in terms of the countries of the former Yugoslavia, they had to hand over and cooperate with the Yugoslav tribunal. So in different situations, that combination of diplomatic, financial and other tools that are in the toolbox of the European Union and many states of the world can be used. What we're trying to do in different situations, for example, last month, we filed a novel application. It's not been tried in the 20 years of the court so far, is an application for confirmation hearing in the absence of Joseph Kony. I think that's very important. It will allow victims who've been waiting for decades to come and appear before the courts if the judges grant the application. It will allow not only the case to be confirmed, but as opposed to the civil law system in which if somebody is arrested, they start all over again. It means that if a case is confirmed, it goes straight to trial. So we need to try to make sure we use the tools that we've got effectively. And one of those also is confirmation hearing in absence. And that should be the new model in different situations. If people are refusing to cooperate, they are intent on remaining fugitives from justice, or if states fail in their responsibilities or are otherwise unable to surrender individuals and provide the cooperation, we have to use to the maximum extent the tools that we have, including confirmation hearing and absence. But I think collectively we have made significant progress. I think there are fewer and fewer parts of the world where people can flee to, where people can live with the belief that they can sleep at peace and escape accountability. And this is why my earlier point of activating the latent domestic jurisdictions is as important, if not more so, than international organizations like the ICC. It's this common front of legality that we need to build and mobilize and put in the front lines in situations in conflict, like Ukraine, but others as well. But also it's this common partnership with states around the world so that people realize when they make decisions for their own sake, for the selfish reasons, stick to legality rather than this unbridled belief that you can steal what you want, take what you want, and kill and rape with abandon and with no accountability. And I think that narrowing of safe havens is going to be really important to prevention and deterrence and the end of impunity, which of course is the subject of the panel discussion today.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up here just because we need to be on time for the following sessions. And it's a pity because I know, I mean, I had more questions and I'm sure there were questions in the room, but unfortunately we cannot take them. However, our speakers will be around during the conference, so you can reach out to them, unfortunately, except Karim Khan, who won't be with us. But thank you very much for joining us online this morning, and thank you to our 4 speakers. Now, before we break for coffee, I have a few more practical points to share with you. First of all, if you did not have time to register when you arrived, you can now do so. You should go to registration and get your badges to make sure you are registered for the rest of the conference. Also, after coffee break at 11:30, you're going to go to the breakout rooms according to the sessions that you have registered for. If you have not registered, you can check with the hostesses outside or in front of the various rooms to see whether you can access those breakout sessions if they're not full already. So check out with the hostesses, including at reception and upstairs. Breakout rooms are on the 1st floor, so you can take the stairs or take the lift at the back of the coffee networking space. And we will be back here for the next plenary session at 5:30. So it's breakout sessions before lunch, forum session this afternoon, and then our next plenary at 5:30. So enjoy a very busy day, and we're looking forward to your contributions in the discussion. Thank you very much.